So the gang and I recently put together our ranking lists for audiophile headphones, which you can find linked in the description below or at headphones.com. This was the result of a month-long effort, and honestly, we could do a whole piece of content just about everything that went into the ranking list. But as I was putting the ranking list together, I kept getting struck by the idea of overrated and underrated headphones. Today, I want to talk about underrated headphones because I think it's a much more interesting question. What is the most underrated audiophile headphone? I think there is actually an answer for this. So today I want to talk about what criteria for me goes into judging the most underrated audiophile headphone, and then obviously tell you what I think the most underrated audiophile headphone is. So let's talk about it. So first, let's talk about what makes a headphone underrated to begin with. The first aspect is obviously going to be, does the person making the judgment of underrated find that headphone to be good in some way? Like, underrated implies a goodness that isn't necessarily recognized by others. Second thing, how the discourse has received that headphone. I think a good example of a headphone that could never be underrated is the Sennheiser HD6XX. Because it is so ubiquitous, but it's also incredibly well liked. Definitely can't be underrated if everyone's talking about it and everyone's talking about it positively, right? But I also think if we're talking about underrated, there has to be some sort of thing about it that would make people maybe rate it negatively. And unfortunately, I think a lot of what happens in the headphone space, especially now, is that a lot of the initial judgment of a headphone is actually done before people hear the headphone. Either a headphone is announced and it looks a certain way and people aren't necessarily excited about that. But there's also, measurements. And as imperfect as these measurements are, which we'll get into, people still take them pretty much at face value. They compare a headphone measurement to a target line that they may be somewhat familiar with, and that's enough for them to conclude whether they'll like the headphone or not. So I think an underrated headphone is also going to be a headphone that maybe has something about it that would be initially off-putting to someone, whether it be something in the design or something in the measured response that would make people say, oh no, I'll definitely not like that. I also think there's a chance that underrated headphones are in general less expensive. Like, I find a lot of the sleeper picks that people put forth as underrated options tend to be in the lower price bracket. And I don't know if it's because more expensive headphones tend to have a smaller audience of perhaps more homogeneously positive voices, or it may be that the expectations for lower price headphones is lower. And the last thing about how at least I would judge underrated is sound quality versus everything else. I think our discourse tends to focus a lot on how something sounds. Maybe rightfully so. It is a hobby about how things sound. But I think when it comes to headphones as devices, there's simply a lot more going on than how a device sounds, namely comfort, build, design, looks. There are a lot of things that would cause me to pick up one headphone versus another headphone that have nothing to do with sound quality. So I think it's likely that the most underrated headphones are potentially headphones that do those other non-sound aspects maybe a little bit better than their sound quality. So the headphone that I think fits all of this criteria, checks all of these boxes, and is most deserving of the title of most underrated audiophile headphone is the Sony MDR MV1. If you've watched much of my content or talked to me on Discord or forums, you might already be aware of how much I like this headphone. But this is a headphone that I think is so underrated, it actively kind of makes me upset. This is probably, of all of the headphones I don't own, the one I wish I did own. So let's go down the checklist and talk about how it does with this entire rubric, starting with the comfort, build, and design, which visually, I love the look of this headphone. In general, I love the look of Sony headphones. I have a special affinity for the look of this headband. It harkens back to the old MDR 7506 that I think most people will be familiar with at some point in their life. But I do think it is a better headband than those. It is more padded and more plush on top. It has a more satisfying arm click adjustment system with numbered adjustments for people like me who always like to have symmetry in terms of how many clicks on each side of the headband. I also just love the ear pads. They're a really soft micro suede material that is ear-shaped, so I think most people are going to find this headphone fairly comfortable around the ear unless they have absolutely massive ears. I think if I had a complaint or two with this headphone design, I would still prefer a suspension strap, something like the Kappa strap. The other thing I wish was a little bit different is, as much as I love the ear pads, I do wish they were just a little bit deeper. I find after a little bit of wearing this headphone, the pads do compress a little bit, so I do get a little bit of my right ear touching the baffle. But even with that little bit of touching, it's one of the most comfortable headphones I've worn for ear comfort. And perhaps the biggest thing is that the weight is insanely low, like to the point where I think most people who pick up this headphone are probably going to think it's really cheap. But like this outer shell here is metal, and the overall design being 220, 230 grams, something like that, it has no bearing on how long it holds up. So I think the build quality on this is exceptional. The comfort is also great. The design is, in my opinion, lovely. When people have praised this headphone in the past, this has been where people tend to praise it the most. Next thing is the price. $400 isn't the cheapest thing in the world, but it's absolutely not unattainable for a lot of people. When you think about things like the Sony ANC headphones, or more expensive ANC headphones like the AirPods Max, I think even for a normal person, $400 kind of fits within the budget range of this is the absolute most I would ever spend on a headphone. But I think for a not normal person, an audiophile, $400 probably isn't that much. So the expectations for this probably aren't going to be that high. So when squaring the kind of looks, design, and build with the price, I think this leads to the MV1 being a package that is kind of unassuming and doesn't really give people super high expectations for what it will be, especially because of the next thing, which is the measurement quirk. And by God, does this have a measurement quirk. So if you've seen any measurements of this on industry standard test fixtures against any of the targets that people are using these days, you'll see a massive peak somewhere in the lower mid treble, around like 6 to 8 kilohertz. I've seen a lot of people online judge this headphone without hearing it because of this massive measurement spike. Yes, that is a correct measurement. That is how this headphone behaves on that test fixture. But I'm not necessarily sure that's how it behaves on human heads. There's evidence to suggest from people like Sean Olive or Fabian Brinkman that headphone test fixtures actually tend to overestimate treble in this exact 6 to 9 kilohertz band. If you look at the data from these sources, you'll see that a lot of the headphone responses when measured on human heads actually dip pretty strongly in this 6 to 9 kilohertz band, and the rigs we use tend not to dip. So when you see this peak on the 5128, for example, I gotta be honest, I don't hear this peak. Like, I hear maybe a very narrow peak right at around 6 kilohertz, but I don't hear any of the elevation between 7 to 9 kilohertz. If anything, this is probably one of the only headphones that is like an over-ear dynamic driver headphone that doesn't have a strong 7-8 kilohertz dip on my head. Like, for me, the Sennheiser HD6XX is kind of a bright headphone because of a 10 kilohertz peak on my head, but it's also a really dark headphone because of a very large 7 to 8 kilohertz dip on my head. And this is something that goes for most headphones I put on my head, but not the MDR MV1. That's all to say, I know a lot of people are going to see a measurement of this headphone and think, oh my God, that's a massive treble spike that looks like a Bayer Dynamic headphone. It looks so bright. This is definitely one area that I think in general for all headphones, people should not be trusting the measurement data as much as they currently are, but also an area where with this headphone specifically, I really think people should reserve their judgment before hearing the headphone, because there's a good chance that the massive treble spike you see on the measurement just is not going to be there on your head. So the next part is probably the easiest to answer. How many people are talking about this thing? Not many people are talking about this thing, to my perception. I see mentions here or there on our Discord server, usually from the same 2 or 3 people, but this is not a headphone I see on a lot of roundups or recommendation lists or anything like that. Even though I think there are things that are uniquely good about this headphone, even just talking about its sound quality, that should put it near the top or at least on a lot of recommendation lists out there. Which brings us to, I guess, the last question, which is, how good is this headphone? While I think it's not something that's going to be for everyone, I think for the kind of person who either is just starting in audiophile and, is a little bit surprised at how bass light a lot of the headphones are, or someone who just knows they want kind of a vivid, exciting listen, this should be on lists above things like the HD6XX or the Focal LX or the Hi-Fi Man Edition XV, even though I think I personally like the sound of all of those headphones a little bit better. They're a little bit more all-rounder-ish. This is a headphone that I think does things no open back dynamic driver really does, especially not at this price range, and balances that with really solid non-sound factors. So the first thing I think this headphone does really well sonically is the mid-range. It's just a natural, normal, slightly warm approach to mid-range tuning that I think If people are going to have an issue with it, it might be that the bass rise bleeds into the mids a little bit. So male vocals, their fundamentals may be a little bit more forward and they might come across a little bit more chesty or resonant as a result. And I think even people who like the 600 and 650 mid-range might like this more because it's a little bit more relaxed, but not enough relaxed that it loses out on the, fantastic texturing that something like an HD 600 or 650 has. And speaking of texturing, the next thing I want to talk about is the bass on this headphone is extremely well extended, like especially for something that has such acoustically open pads and an acoustically open back volume. It's pretty clear that where they're getting the bass extension is from a mix of the driver itself being engineered for a very low resonance frequency, but also the baffle itself is, I'm going to say, not the most open. So it's kind of like a Sennheiser 6 series headphone where especially the 650, where the baffle is a little bit more restricted at bass frequencies than at mid-range or treble frequencies. So it does seal in a little bit more bass seemingly on this headphone. But that said, it is still an open feeling headphone with a lot of bass. And when I say a lot of bass, I mean it extends as well as basically any planar magnetic headphone you can think of. So, the Hi-Fi Man Edition XV I have behind me, they extend basically the same. But unlike the, planar magnetic headphones, this has a substantial rise in the bass, like Harman levels of bass emphasis and extension, but in an open back headphone. Like I can't really think of any others that do that except for maybe the Sennheiser HD490 Pro, which I think has less bass and a different mid-range structure, which I'll talk about in a second, and the Meze 105 Air, which might have a similar level of amplitude. I'm not sure it extends as well, and it also has mid-range issues. What I love so much about this bass profile is, one, it's not a distinct Harman shelf, so you don't get that tuck in the 200 hertz region that kind of makes kick drums boom really hard and makes bass guitars sound really like juicy, but it just coheres a lot better with the mid-range because it doesn't have that. Also, because the mid-range in the 1 to 3 kilohertz region is just normal, like an HD 600 or 650, you get more of a sense of texturing in the crackly, fiery overtones of, say distorted bass or plucked bass or bass synthesizer. A lot of that more effervescent texturing is available on this, where it's either not available so much on something like the 490 Pro that dips a little bit too much in the 2 kilohertz region, or is kind of brought forward a little bit too much, like on things like the 105 Air, where there's a 4 kilohertz thing that kind of makes the headphone too dry and scratchy and a little bit thin sounding, even though there is technically a lot of bass. This, I think, provides something that's more of an easy midpoint between audiophile sensibilities and typical consumer sensibilities, where you get a lot of bass, but you do get a kind of more sensible mid-range and treble profile than you do on a lot of normal consumer headphones. It's such that I think a person won't be quite as jarred or surprised by this headphone versus, say, going from a Sony WH-1000 XM5 to an HD 650 and being like, oh, where'd all of the bass and treble go? While this is absolutely going to be the headphone I would recommend to someone who's maybe more accustomed to consumer headphones, like a wireless ANC headphone with a lot of bass or a gaming headset with a lot of bass, I don't think that's the limit of this headphone's appeal. I am not that person. I am a neutral headphone enjoyer, basically to a T. Like, I am the kind of person that typically tries to avoid V-shaped headphones. But this is one of the most enjoyable headphones I have around, and it's one of the ones I pick up the most often, not only because its built-in comfort is great, but because I really like the sound presentation. It does the same things I like about the HD 650, similarly good, if not better, like the mid-range, while also improving on it in important ways, like the bass extension and prominence and, the treble being a little bit more filled in, such that I think if you're a neutral headphone enjoyer and you like headphones like the HD 650, this is the V-shaped headphone you should be trying, because it nails all of the built-in comfort stuff at least as well as the 6 Series does, and nails the mid-range at least as well as the 6 Series does, while also having a different flavor of bass and treble that I actually think is totally viable for a headphone in 2026. And that's the reason I'm making this video right now. This came out a few years ago, but the more time passes, the more solid it kind of reveals itself to be. I see basically no discussion of this headphone, despite being a headphone made by a massive brand at a reasonable price with an awesome comfort profile and a really respectable take on a V-shaped signature. Before I close out this video, I do want to mention, there are downsides about this headphone. The bass isn't perfect. It's a little bit poofy. It's a little bit overwhelming. And the treble isn't perfect. It's a little bit glassy. It's a little bit bright, a little bit sharp on certain things. But this is a headphone that challenged my own ideas about my preferences as well as how to interpret measurement data, such that, yeah, I just think it's a way more important headphone than it currently gets credit for. So this is me putting my stamp of approval on it and saying, if you have a chance to try this headphone, you should try it. So for the sound score, I think I give this around a 6. If you're not familiar with my ranking system, a very good score. Like, this is a very good sounding headphone. And then I think for the overall, it gets around a 6.5 or a 6.6, which I'm pretty sure puts it in the top 5. The overall score incorporates comfort and value, which, you know, this is definitely where I think this headphone kind of sets itself apart from a lot of more expensive headphones. But I think because of the score it gets, it's one of the best overall headphones, period. And the fact that so few people talk about it is kind of a shame. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. So if you liked it, definitely hit the like button. If you want to see more like it, definitely hit the subscribe button. If you want to talk to me about the contents of this video or about the MDR MV1 or about anything really, you can hit me up on our Discord server at discord.gg/headphones or at our forum at forum.headphones.com. And full disclosure, this video actually exists because this is Andrew's headphone, and I need to give it back to him next week. And I'm really upset that I have to do so, because this is one of the headphones I reach for most because of its solid comfort and build profile, but also because of its unique approach to tuning. I have a bunch of neutral headphones around here. I can listen to neutral 5 different ways, but this is the only V-shaped headphone in, you know, the price range I can afford that I would say I really, really enjoy listening to. So it's kind of a bummer that I have to give it back, but I probably will be buying one in the foreseeable future. But yeah, that's the end of this video. I'm gonna go enjoy whatever time I have left with this thing before I have to give it back to Andrew. I'll see you guys later. Peace.